It was more than 35 years ago. My younger brother and I were out playing in our backyard with little green army men. You know, that's what kids used to do back in the old days before the days of video games and mobile devices. We played outside and we played with toys. Now, we had taken a bunch of logs and 2x4s and had constructed this elaborate battlefield behind our garage. And we had laid out all of our army men ready for battle. We collected a whole bunch of rotten pears that had fallen off of the pear tree, and we were using them as bombs, launching them at each other's army men, watching the pears explode and kill all the little green guys. When at one point in the game, my brother cheated. He did something that ticked me off. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I do remember my response. I was so mad, I picked up one of the 2x4s that had been laid out as a bridge between two of the logs, and I took the 2x4, and I went over to the log that had most of his army men on it, and I was just going to pound it. I was just going to obliterate his entire army with one fell swoop. So I took the 2x4, and I slammed it down on the log, and as I let go of it, and it hit the log, it quickly bounced right back up, and it cracked my brother right across the top of the head. Blood was just pouring down his face, and he ran into the house screaming, "Mother, Mother!" And I knew I was in serious trouble. I was also mad because he'd been cheating at the Army Man game. So I stood there in the backyard for a couple of minutes, waiting my mother to come out. Eventually she did, with my brother in tow, and she yelled at me as she pulled my brother to the car. She said, "Bart, now look what you've done. I have to take Michael to the hospital to get stitches in his head." And Michael passed by. He had a big towel covering his head, and he kind of gave me that look like, "Ha, ha, you're in trouble." And I was in some serious trouble. I stayed at home, waited for my mom a couple of hours to come back, and then I got the grounding of my life. Now, it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. My family had gotten together for Thanksgiving or Christmas or something, and we were all kind of sitting around on the patio recounting stories of my youth and my brother when we were growing up, and this event came up. And so we started kind of retelling the events as it had taken place, and as we were telling the story, I was watching my mom, and she had this look of confusion on her face as we told the story. And when we were all done, she confessed that she never realized that me hitting Michael in the head with the 2x4 was an accident. Because when Michael had come into the house, he had said, "Mom, Bart hit me in the head with a 2x4. So she had pictured that I had picked up this 2x4 and actually cracked him across the skull. And so the consequences that I faced were as a result of her thinking that I'd actually done it on purpose. But she didn't realize it was an accident. And my brother, Michael, the little brother, never offered up the information that it had actually been done on accident. Now, I have two sons myself today. They are 11 and 12 years old. They get along pretty well together for the most part, but my younger son, Ephraim, who's 11, can often get on the nerves of my older son, Silas, who is 12. In fact, there's a lot that Ephraim does that actually annoys Silas quite a bit. The way that Ephraim breathes annoys Silas. The way that he chews his food annoys Silas. The way that he laughs at cartoons annoys him. Sometimes his mere presence in the room is quite annoying to Silas. And I've spent a lot of time trying to help Silas understand that Ephraim can't help it. Now, I know some of you that are here today are little brothers. Some of you are older brothers. And maybe this is something that you've never quite figured out. Now, I can't scientifically prove this, but I do have a theory. And this is what I've shared with my sons. See, little brothers can't help but be annoying because all little brothers have what is called the annoying gene. See, it's genetic. A little brother is annoying because it's part of their DNA. Little brothers carry the annoying gene, so they can't help it. Now, we're going to be starting a new series today called No Average Joe. If you've been in church for any length of time, maybe you grew up going to Sunday school or vacation Bible school, the story that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next month is one that's probably familiar to you. It's a story that comes from the Old Testament book of Genesis, and it's about a boy named Joseph whose father loved him a lot. In fact, he had a very fancy coat. There was even a Broadway musical made of the story of Joseph called Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Now, part of the problem with the story of Joseph, as we've learned it in Sunday school, is it often gets indicted as somewhat of a children's story or a fairy tale. But what I think you're going to notice over the course of the next few weeks as we explore this story is that the version that you might have learned in Sunday school was probably very watered down, probably a little on the filtered side when it comes to young audiences, because the family that this story centers around is perhaps one of the most dysfunctional families that ever walked the face of the earth. Okay, we've got issues like trickery and deceit and lying. There's all kinds of stuff like that, but that's just the surface level. Also in this family are things like incest, attempted rape, murder. I mean, this stuff is just nasty, nasty stuff. In fact, you're going to be glad that the family members in this family don't fill the branches of your family tree. But at the center of the story is this young man named Joseph. Now, Joseph is a guy that today we look at as being probably one of the most significant biblical historical figures ever. He was a world changer. But here's one thing that was definitely true about Joseph. He was perhaps one of the most annoying little brothers ever. Our story begins in Genesis chapter 37, beginning at verse 2. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Now, Jacob, who is Joseph's father, is the grandson of a man named Abraham. Abraham and Sarah had lived a couple of generations before. They had been a couple that had been barren in their old age. And God had come to them and made a promise that he was going to give them a son. And from that son, he was going to raise up a great nation. Abraham and Sarah had a son named Isaac, and Isaac then had two twin sons named Jacob and Esau. And Jacob, his son, secondborn of the twins, is the one that is the father of this young man named Joseph. It's with Jacob's family that God begins to really bring about the promise that he had made to Abraham. He told Abraham that his descendants were going to outnumber the stars in the sky. And we see that Jacob's family is the first one that really begins to flourish, and there are many, many descendants that are going to come from Jacob's family. Jacob has 12 sons and probably a number of daughters, and it's between the births of his last two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, that God renames Jacob Israel. So you're going to see in the text, sometimes he's referred to as Jacob, sometimes as Israel. And it's because his new name is Israel that the descendants of Jacob are referred to as the Israelites. Now, at the time we pick up the story, Jacob is an old man. He's got 12 sons, probably many daughters, even some grandchildren that are living there with the family. And Joseph, who's the center figure in our story here, is a teenager. He spends his days working out with his older brothers and half-brothers, tending his father's flocks. Some of the brothers that he would be working for here would be in their 30s, 40s. Some of them would have their own wives and children. Some of them might have even had their own grandchildren at this point. Because Joseph is a typical annoying little brother, he's simply incapable of going out and working in the fields for his brothers and just doing the job like a typical employee. He can't just punch in, do his work, punch out. He's actually got to exercise his gifts as an annoying little brother. And so the text tells us that he's seeing his older brothers do some stuff that's going to tick their father off, and he rats them out. Maybe he sees them sort of mismanaging the business. The brothers would be responsible for taking care of the father's entire estate and managing his whole business. Maybe they've got some shady side deals going on. Maybe they're drinking too much on the job. Maybe they're just not honest or doing an honest day's work when they're out supposedly doing their work. Whatever it is, Joseph feels the need to come and tattle on his brothers, to rat them out. Now, we're going to continue in the text. Verse 3 of chapter 37 says, "Now Israel," that's Jacob, "he loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he'd been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." Now, in all fairness to Joseph, his own father didn't necessarily set him up for the greatest success as far as his relationship with his brothers were concerned. In fact, we might even say that this could be one of the best examples of bad parenting ever. You know, as parents, even if you have a favorite child, you certainly can't let your children know that one of them is the favorite child. And Jacob does nothing to hide the fact that Joseph is his favorite son. In fact, he goes all the way to promote it. He gives him a fancy coat to show his favor to Joseph as his favorite son. Genesis 37:5 says that Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So we see clearly here that the annoying little brother gene is working at full capacity. Verse 9 continues, and it says he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, because we have the end of the story, and this is a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't ever read the story or don't know the end of the story, we see that these dreams that Joseph is having are actually prophetic dreams. God has given him a spiritual gift that allows him to interpret dreams. So he's actually got the gift of prophecy and the gift of dream interpretation. At this point in Joseph's life, these dreams and this gift are actually not serving God in any specific way. We're going to see later on that God is going to use these gifts to actually bring about part of his plan. But at this point in time, Joseph is doing nothing but creating more tension and more animosity in his family by exercising this gift, by sharing his dreams. Now, the reason I believe that Joseph is having such a tough time exercising this gift in a constructive way is because he's lacking probably one of the most essential ingredients to living a blessed, God-honoring life. And that is that Joseph has no humility. That's the missing ingredient. Joseph lacks humility. He's basically going like, "Hey, brothers, you know what? I know every day I go out into the field and I help you guys with the flocks, and you're all like bossing me around and you're shoving me around because I'm so young. But hey, one of these days, like I'm going to rise up to the top and you're going to be bowing down before me. How about them apples?" And of course, the brothers, they can't stand him. In fact, the text tells us that they didn't have a kind word to say to him. They hated him. And this is probably not the best way for Joseph to be winning friends and influencing people. We say this all the time around here at Grasslands, and I want you to write this down, especially if you're taking notes today. Even if you're not taking notes, go ahead and write this down. Humility is the greatest commodity in God's economy. I'll say that again. Humility is the greatest commodity in God's economy. You know, it's one thing to be rich with spiritual gifts and blessings from God, but the most valuable asset that we possess as followers of Jesus, as people who are keepers of his hope, as we live out our faith life, the most valuable asset that we have is humility. You know, giftedness and blessing is not an excuse for bad behavior. Just because we have been blessed by God with certain spiritual gifts or maybe material blessings, that doesn't give us an excuse to act badly. It is possible for a godly man, a godly woman, a godly person to actually make God look bad. Even if God has blessed your life and God has gifted you, it is still possible based on the way that you play out those gifts and the way that you utilize those blessings to make God look bad. There's a story in Mark chapter 9. Jesus and his disciples are out wandering around, which is what they often did. They're on their way to a city called Capernaum, and they're out on a road, and Jesus has just told his disciples that he's going to be arrested and executed, and then he's going to come back to life. Now they get to Capernaum, and they get to the house where they're going to be setting up camp for the next little while, and Jesus kind of pulls the disciples aside, and he says, "Hey, when we were out on the road, you guys were having an argument. Why don't you tell me what you were arguing about?" Now, Jesus, of course, he knew what they were arguing about. Even if he hadn't heard the conversation, he is Jesus after all, so he knows everything, and he knew what they were arguing about. And when he asked them to tell him, they basically clammed up. They didn't want to tell him. And the reason they didn't want to tell him was that they were embarrassed. Because right after, not 5 minutes after Jesus had told them that he was going to be arrested and executed, they're out on the road having an argument about which one of them is the best. Which one of them is going to have the right hand of Jesus when he kicks the Romans' butts and sets up his new palatial estate? They're actually jockeying for position in Jesus' kingdom. And Jesus, he knew what they were talking about, and he says this to them in John chapter 9, verse 35. He says, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." In other words, He who humbles himself will be exalted, and he who exalts himself will ultimately be humbled. And that's exactly what we're going to see play out in the life of annoying Joe here. Based on the way he's treating his family and the way that he's building relationships with his brothers, he's definitely not humbling himself. In fact, he's exalting himself. He's talking about the fact that his dreams are saying, hey, I'm going to rise above the rest of you, and he's boasting about it. The end result is that Joseph is about to be humbled. I want you to write this down. This is another really important thing for us to learn. And that is that it does no good to have spiritual maturity without relational maturity. It does no good to have spiritual maturity without relational maturity. See, Jesus told his disciples, and this extends all the way to us today, those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, we as his disciples, Jesus said, my disciples are going to be known by their love for one another. Not their gifting, not their blessing, not the abundant life that they live, but the abundant love that they display. That's the identifier for Jesus' followers. It's not signs and wonders. It's not speaking in tongues. It's not the ability to prophesy or to heal. It's love. The Apostle Paul wrote that if you have all that other stuff, if you have all those great gifts from God, like prophecy and speaking in tongues and all that stuff, but you don't have love, that you're doing nothing but wasting space. I heard Pastor Chris Brown put it this way: when it comes to our spiritual gifts and our blessings and the way that we exercise those things in our lives, we need to ask ourselves the questions: do I reveal or do I repel? Is the way that I live out my life and exercise my gifts, does that reveal God and his love for humanity, or does it repel people from wanting to know the God that I know and love? And so as you examine your life and the way that you play out your commitment to Jesus, ask yourself that question. Do I reveal Jesus and his love and his grace and his mercy, or do I repel people from getting to know the God that I know and love? It does no good to have spiritual maturity without relational maturity. As we look at Joseph, we see very clearly that he lacks relational maturity. The way that he is exercising this gift that God has given him is not revealing God's love to his brothers. It's actually repelling his brothers from him. He's basically like this giant can of deep desert off, right? Sprays himself and everybody is repelled. His lack of humility is a great repellent. His brothers couldn't speak a kind word to him. His brothers hated him. And we ought to know, based on what the Bible teaches us, is that pride comes before a fall. Joseph is about to have a great fall. He's going to fall right into a pit. Continuing at verse 12 of chapter 37, it says, "Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to him, 'Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me.' Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron." Now, my suspicion here is that this is probably part of the pattern between Jacob and Joseph. Jacob was actually sending Joseph out to spy on his brothers to see if they were doing wrong things. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come, now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't here. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Can you imagine how jacked up a family has to be where the majority of the siblings actually don't find any problem with just selling their brother into slavery? I mean, at first they wanted to kill him. Reuben obviously was a little bit on the outside. Reuben is the oldest brother, but even Reuben didn't fight too hard against the masses when push came to shove, and ultimately he's also implicated in this terrible event. Now, your Sunday school flannel graph lesson might have ended here, and your Sunday school teacher would say, boys and girls, it's good if you don't sell your brothers and sisters. That makes God unhappy if you sell your brothers and sisters. And today we might say, let's not go posting any ads on Kijiji for your siblings. That's not a good thing. But really what I want to look at today, where I want to land the plane, is in this. God had gifted Joseph. Joseph was a very gifted young man, and God had a clear plan for Joseph's life and how he intended to use him and to use these gifts. But Joseph, at this particular stage in his life, he was not ready to be used by God. He was still rough around the edges. And add to the fact that his home life and his family life was not conducive for him maturing in the areas of life that God needed him to mature. In this environment that Joseph was growing up in, based on the way that his father was treating him and based on the animosity they had with his siblings, it was not a place where Joseph was really going to be able to grow into being the man that God had ordained him to be. Now, I'm not going to tell you that God caused Joseph to be sold into slavery. What Joseph's brothers did was a sin, and God doesn't cause people to sin. But I will say, just as Joseph reveals in his own words later, that God, he took what the brothers intended for bad and he turned it into something good. God used the sin of these men and used it to help one of his own plans come to fruition. And it's going to be through the circumstances that Joseph is going to face over the next probably couple of decades of his life that we're going to see him mature and grow into the man that God designed him to be. It's in the circumstances that Joseph is about to face where he's going to begin to grab hold of this great commodity that he needs in his life, which is humility. Joseph is seriously going to be humbled, and this is going to allow him to grow into the man that God needs him to be. You see, God had a plan for Joseph's life. And as long as Joseph was willing to go along with that plan, there was really nothing that anyone could do to derail that plan. As long as Joseph was compliant to go with where God wanted him to go, it didn't matter what his brothers did. God's plan was still going to come to fruition. And God has a plan for your life. He's gifted you. He's designed you to fulfill a specific role in his kingdom building plans. And the only thing that can derail God's plans for your life is your unwillingness to go along with those plans. We all face different circumstances and situations in our lives, and we might ask ourselves the questions, can I really be used by God? But I will tell you this, as long as you were compliant, as long as you were willing to go with God's plan, there's nothing that can derail God's plan. In the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, there's a scene where Jeremiah, who's a prophet for God, is really frustrated because the Israelites have turned their backs on God. They're not honoring God with the way they're living. And Jeremiah is questioning whether or not God can really redeem these people for his purposes as messed up as they've gotten. And so God tells Jeremiah to go and visit the potter's house. So Jeremiah does what God tells him to do. He goes to the potter's home and he watches the potter create a piece of pottery. And as that potter is spinning that wheel and molding the clay in his hands, as he's almost done, Jeremiah notices that there's a mar in the pot. And the potter, instead of throwing it away or saying that it's complete but it's messed up, he basically continues to work it. He starts again. He continues to spin that wheel and shape that piece of pottery until it looks exactly the way he wants it to look. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. You know, such is the way that God works out the mars and the imperfections in our own lives. Like that pot, we all have imperfections. We've all got cracks. We've all got stuff and impurities in our lives that, from a human perspective, may make us seem like we are not qualified or we have disqualified ourselves from being used by God. But as long as we're willing to stay on the wheel, as long as we're willing to stay within the hands of the potter, there's nothing that God can't work out in our lives. He will continue to shape us and to form us into the people that He's designed us to be. There's nothing that you've done. There's nothing that you can do. There's nothing that anyone has done to you. Nothing that anyone has done in your life that disqualifies you from being used by God. Now, like Joseph, you might not be ready yet. Maybe your current circumstances are circumstances in which you can't really grow in the areas that God wants and needs you to grow. It doesn't necessarily disqualify you. It might just mean that there's going to be some more seasoning and some more work that God needs to do in your life so that you can mature and grow into the person that He wants you to be. You know, like Joseph, we've just got to be compliant. We've got to be willing to go with God. We've got to remain on the wheel. We've got to remain in the potter's hands so that we can become the piece of art that God has preordained us to be. It doesn't matter what hardships you face in life. It doesn't matter what pits you might find yourself in. You know, Joseph found himself in a pit, and then he found himself in slavery, and we're going to see over the course of the next few weeks, he found himself in some pretty dire situations and circumstances. But God was always at work behind the scenes. In fact, one of the favorite things about this story is that as Jacob says, I will not stop mourning until I join my son in the grave. The very next word in the text says, meanwhile. Meanwhile, God is about to do something great in and through Joseph's life. And so it doesn't matter what pit you find yourself in, what struggles you're going through in life, how challenged you might find life in your current set of circumstances. God is working behind the scenes to help you grow to be the person that He's designed you to be. I hope you find that encouraging. Now, next week, we're going to continue in this adventure of Joseph. We're going to see just how God kept on spinning that wheel and shaping him into a man who is ultimately going to change history.